Good evening, boils and ghouls. Tonight's terror tale will have you dying to call in sick. Our poor protagonist is about to learn that in this company, the employee handbook has bite. The benefits are beastly, and onboarding takes on a whole new meaning of terror. So, sharpen your pencils, grab your coffee, and prepare for a performance review from hell. Because here, dear Fright fans, confidentiality isn't just a policy, it's a death sentence. It's a chilling little corporate creeper I like to call the HR nightmare.
I remember walking into the office on my first day, full of that nervous excitement you get when you start something new, the kind that tricks you into believing everything will finally be different. The HR department had painted it as a dream job, dynamic, forward thinking, a beacon of opportunity in a city where reinvention was currency. But as I stepped into the lobby, surrounded by glass walls that reflected me endlessly, I felt small. The building was sleek, modern, unnervingly clean, like it had been scrubbed of personality. The receptionist, Megan, greeted me with a smile that stretched wide, too wide, and handed me a badge. Her voice was warm, but her eyes flickered, like she was reading from a script. "Welcome aboard," she said. I tried to smile back, but the badge felt unnaturally cold against my hand. And for a moment, I swore the glass behind her warped, twisting my reflection into something I couldn't recognize. I followed the signs to the HR department, located on the top floor. The elevator ride was unnervingly smooth, almost too perfect, as though the machine itself wanted me to feel at ease. The numbers on the display ticked upward, slower than usual, dragging out the seconds, each one a bead of sweat down my back. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a hallway so pristine it felt untouched by time. White walls gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, and polished floors reflected my steps back at me. It smelled sterile, like new plastic or like something trying too hard to seem clean. Then I saw them, the HR team. They sat at their desks, perfectly still, dressed in identical black suits. Their faces were blank, a chilling tableau of professionalism devoid of life. A woman with sharp, short blonde hair glanced up as I passed. Her eyes were empty, and her nod was so brief it felt mechanical, like a reflex. "Welcome, welcome," a voice rang out, too cheery for the silence. Karen, the head of HR, emerged from the back office. Her voice dripped with sweetness, but the kind that leaves a bitter aftertaste. Her smile stretched wide, too wide, and her unblinking eyes pierced through me like twin blades. It was her eyes that struck me most. They didn't match her smile. If anything, they looked hungry. Karen led me to my desk, her heels clicking against the polished floors in perfect rhythm. The office was unnervingly quiet. Not the subdued hum of a busy workplace, but an oppressive, unnatural silence, as if the air itself was waiting. My own footsteps sounded muffled, swallowed by the weight of it. When we reached my desk, Karen handed me a thick employee handbook. Its weight was disproportionate, heavier than it should have been, and the laminated cover gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Read through this, and you'll be all set," she said, her voice regaining that saccharine tone. "There are just a few things we expect of all new employees. Most importantly, confidentiality. HR is a delicate matter. We protect the company, and we protect each other." I nodded, though unease coiled in my chest. The way she said protect felt less like a promise and more like a warning. Karen offered a handshake, firm, calculated, and turned to leave, but she paused at her office door. glancing back over her shoulder. "Oh, and don't forget," she said, her voice dropping into something colder, sharper, as if it had been hollowed out. "Everything is as it seems here, until it isn't." The words hung in the air, bending it. For a moment, her shadow stretched impossibly long across the wall, its edges flickering like a glitch in reality. Then, without another word, she vanished into her office, leaving the silence to close in around me. At first, everything seemed fine, normal even. I arrived early every day, worked through my tasks diligently, and kept to myself. The HR department was quiet, too quiet, but everything seemed to run like a well-oiled machine. The people were professional, courteous, almost overly so at times, but nothing that screamed alarm bells. I buried myself in my work, convincing myself how lucky I was to have landed a job like this. The building itself was immaculate, a monument to corporate perfection. Glass walls reflected the city skyline in shimmering clarity. Immaculate conference rooms stood ready for meetings, and the high-end furniture looked like it had been lifted straight out of a design catalog. Everything was in its place, and everything was flawless. But perfection has its price. I noticed it slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The eerie silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of something else, heavy and oppressive. There were no casual conversations, no bursts of laughter from break rooms, no hum of life. Even the usual office sounds, ringing phones, the clatter of keyboards, seemed muted, as though the air itself swallowed them. The HR staff were the only ones who spoke, their whispers cutting through the silence with a strange precision, always formal, always measured. And then there were the glass walls. At first, I didn't think much of them, but sometimes, when I glanced up, the reflections seemed off, just slightly, as though they were lagging behind or distorted in a way that didn't match the clean, sterile lighting of the office. I shook it off. It had to be the angle or the glass. It had to be something rational, but the unease lingered no matter how much I tried to ignore it. There were no emails from coworkers, no friendly, "Hey, how's it going?" when I passed someone in the hall. The silence followed me everywhere, an invisible companion. Whenever I walked into the break room, conversations would cease abruptly, replaced by the unsettling weight of a dozen eyes following my every move. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but it wasn't welcoming either. It felt curated, controlled, like they were waiting for me to slip up. After a few weeks, I started noticing the little things, subtle clues that whispered all was not well. The first was a locked cabinet in the HR department, tucked into the corner, as if it was trying not to be seen. It wasn't like the other filing cabinets, which were sleek and modern. This one was an industrial behemoth, forged from heavy pitted metal and secured with a thick padlock that looked as old as the building itself. One day, as I passed it on my way to the printer, something caught my eye. A shadow through the narrow bars of the lock. A hand, or something that looked like a hand, at least. The shape was fleeting, there, and gone, so quickly I thought I might have imagined it. I tried to shake it off, a trick of the light, a misplaced object. But as I walked away, the air near the cabinet felt colder, and a strange metallic hum lingered in my ears. The second thing I noticed was the new hire orientation. I wasn't part of it. My start date had been off-cycle, but I saw the fresh batch of employees arrive each week. They always looked the same at first, eager, bright-eyed, full of the same nervous excitement I'd felt on my first day. But by the end of their orientation, something had changed. Their smiles were gone, their eyes hollowed out, their steps heavier. They walked out of the HR department like husks, shells of the people they'd been just hours before. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was as though something had been taken from them. Their faces all carried the same blank expression, the kind you'd expect from mannequins dressed in office attire. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they pretended not to. And then there was Karen. She was everywhere, always watching. Every time I took a break, she was there, perched in the corner of the break room, sipping her coffee with a calm detachment, as though she were part of the furniture. She never made small talk, never tried to blend in. She didn't have to. It was as if she already knew everything about you, like she'd rifled through the deepest corners of your mind and filed your secrets away. Her presence was oppressive, her gaze a weight I could feel even when I wasn't looking at her. Every glance she sent my way felt deliberate, loaded with unspoken authority. And somehow, she was always in the right place, at the right time, like she was following a script written just for her. I began to wonder if she ever actually left the office, or if she was even human at all. I tried not to think about it too much. After all, I was new. It had to be my nerves, right? Everyone else seemed fine. The employees, the HR staff, even the cleaners. They all kept their distance, but that wasn't unusual in an office, was it? It was easier to believe I was imagining things, that I just needed more time to adjust. But then came the night I stayed late to finish some work. The office was empty, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums. The hum of the air conditioning and the buzz of the fluorescent lights were the only sounds, or so I thought. Then I heard it, faint at first, like a distant whisper, a low murmur that seemed to seep from the walls. I froze, straining to listen, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than the building settling or the pipes groaning. But this was different. The sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like it had a purpose, like it was alive. My skin prickled as I turned toward the HR office. That's when I saw it. The shadow under the door. It shouldn't have been moving, but it was. It slithered, curling and uncurling, its shape shifting as though it were testing the edges of the doorframe. It wasn't like any shadow I'd ever seen. It felt sentient, aware. I wanted to walk away, to leave the building and forget the sound, the shadow, the creeping dread, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, and the feeling crept up my spine like cold fingers. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the tricks of a tired mind. But deep down, I knew something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain, and it was crawling under my skin, waiting for me to notice it fully. The first real sign that something was horribly wrong came 2 weeks after the incident with the shadow. It wasn't the whispers in the walls or the hollowed faces of the new hires. It was the letter. It arrived in my inbox late one night, long after most of the office had emptied out. The subject line seemed innocent enough. Your employee review, immediate attention required. I hesitated, my cursor hovering over it, an unease curling in my stomach. I hadn't seen Karen much since my first day, only in passing, her cold gaze brushing over me like an afterthought. But this email, it felt different, personal. I clicked it open, and the message stared back at me in stark, sterile text. We've noticed some irregularities in your behavior. We need to address this in person. You are to report to HR immediately. Failure to do so will result in consequences. Irregularities. The word hit me like a slap, sharp and accusing. I'd been doing my job well. My boss had even praised me last week. What irregularities could they mean? The message was devoid of context, cold and clinical, but the weight of its demand was unmistakable. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the final line. Failure to do so will result in consequences. The words seemed to pulse on the screen, almost alive, and for a fleeting moment, the edges of the email blurred, as if the message itself was unstable. I blinked, and it was normal again, pristine and unyielding. I glanced at the clock. It was 10:15 p.m., yet the email's timestamp read 2:47 a.m. How could that be? I told myself it was a glitch, a mistake, but the creeping dread in my chest knew better. This wasn't a request, it was a summons, and there was no escaping it. My stomach dropped. The email itself was almost too polite, like a customer service message crafted to soothe while delivering bad news. But that final line, it wasn't polite at all. It was a command, a veiled threat wrapped in corporate formality. I froze, rereading the word irregularities. What could they mean? I hadn't done anything unusual, at least nothing I thought would stand out. I glanced up from my screen, the unease in my chest growing heavier. The office was silent, oppressively so. The hum of the air conditioning felt louder than it should, a dull roar against the stillness. The walls seemed closer now, the room somehow smaller. I didn't want to go to HR. I'd already been uneasy about them, but this email confirmed it. Something was wrong, and yet there was no way out. The email wasn't asking, it was demanding. Compliance wasn't optional. My legs felt leaden as I walked down the hallway toward HR. Each step echoed faintly, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the thick, oppressive quiet. The closer I got, the darker the hallway seemed, even though the overhead lights burned steadily. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but my hands were clammy, my pulse racing. When I reached the HR office, the door was ajar, just like the night I'd seen the shadow. That memory surfaced unbidden, the slithering black form flickering in my mind's eye. I paused, hesitating, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavier here, charged with something I couldn't name, and the faintest hum, different from the air conditioning, seemed to vibrate through the floor. I told myself I had no choice. I had to go in. But as I stood there, staring at the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay beyond it was waiting for me. Inside, Karen was standing by her desk, her back to me. She didn't move when I stepped in, but her presence was palpable, oppressive. It was as though her shadow stretched beyond the confines of her body, filling the room. The air felt heavier here, colder. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their usual bright glare muted, casting the room in an unsettling half-light. "Sit down," Karen said, without turning. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a blade hidden in velvet. I hesitated, but something in her tone left no room for refusal. I sank into the chair across from her desk. She didn't sit. Instead, she remained standing, her posture unnaturally still, her gaze fixed on me the moment she turned. Her eyes were darker than I remembered, or maybe it was just the lighting. Either way, they bore into me, unblinking. "I've been watching you," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice didn't echo in the room. It seemed to hang there, heavy and deliberate. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" My mouth went dry. Understand? Understand what? I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. "You're not like them," she continued, her tone almost pitying, but not quite. "You don't belong here." The words landed like a blow, though I couldn't say why. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, as though it were an immutable truth I had no right to deny. I don't understand, I managed to stammer. Her smile widened, stretching too far. Her teeth gleamed in the dim light, unnervingly white. She leaned forward slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes, a glint of something not quite human. "This company isn't what it seems," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, though it still filled the room. "And neither am I." Her words didn't feel like a confession. They felt like a test, and I had the sinking feeling I was failing. At that moment, the door to the HR office slammed shut behind me, and the air seemed to change, thicker, heavier, like it carried a weight that pressed against my chest. The walls felt closer, the sterile white of the room almost suffocating in its perfection. My heart pounded against my ribs, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. It was as though the room itself was holding me in place. "There are things you don't know about HR," Karen said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, its softness somehow more menacing than any shout. "And things you can never unlearn." Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, sharp enough to slice through my feeble composure. "You've seen the cabinet, haven't you?" I didn't answer, but my eyes betrayed me, darting toward the shadowy corner where the cabinet stood. Karen's lips curled into a dark smile, a predator pleased with its prey. "You're not the first to be curious," she said, her voice almost playful now, a mockery of warmth, "and you won't be the last." Before I could even process her words, a sharp click echoed behind me. My stomach dropped. The cabinet's heavy lock had unlatched on its own, the sound reverberating in the eerie stillness. My body tensed, every muscle coiled to flee, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear that felt alive. The cabinet door creaked open, inch by agonizing inch, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. The air grew colder, carrying a metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. It wasn't empty. Shadows moved within, slowly, deliberately, as though aware of my gaze. Karen's voice shattered the silence, light and lilting, a sharp contrast to the suffocating dread. "Come with me," she said, her tone unnervingly cheerful, like a tour guide inviting me to explore a charming ruin. "It's time for you to see what lies beyond this office." My mind raced, grasping for any rational explanation, but the weight pressing down on my chest drowned every thought in a sea of panic. Was this a test? A joke? Or something much worse? I didn't know. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. And yet, as Karen gestured toward the open cabinet, my feet betrayed me, dragging me closer to the yawning darkness that waited beyond. I stood up, too afraid to argue, and followed her toward the cabinet. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the air itself conspired to hold me back. The walls seemed to press inward, narrowing the hallway with every breath. My heart thundered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, a desperate drum warning me to turn back. Karen reached for the cabinet, her hand hovering just inches from the door. She hesitated. For a fraction of a second, her fingers trembled, and her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, wavered. In that brief instant, I saw something I never thought possible. Fear. Real, unguarded fear. It flickered across her face like a shadow, gone before I could fully register it. Then, with a sharp motion, she flung the cabinet door open. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting into my lungs as I leaned forward to peer inside. At first, there was nothing, just shadows, deep and crawling, seeping from the edges like black ink, spilling into water. They twisted and coiled, shifting with a life of their own, as if the darkness itself was alive. And then I saw it, a hand, or what was left of one. Its flesh was jagged, burned, and twisted, the fingers gnarled and unnaturally long. It looked like it had been ripped from something, or someone. It twitched, the grotesque motion sending a jolt of nausea through me. The shadows clung to it, weaving around the mangled flesh like they were feeding off it, or perhaps giving it life. I stumbled back, gasping for air, my vision blurred, and my legs threatened to collapse beneath me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the sheer, icy terror clawing at my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. "Welcome to the real HR," Karen whispered, her voice a cold, venomous hiss. It carried a finality that froze my blood. I knew then, with terrifying certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. The hand, if it could even be called that, seemed to twitch, its gnarled fingers curling like it was beckoning me closer. My legs felt rooted to the ground, as if the air around me had solidified, trapping me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating wrongness of the moment, but I couldn't. Something deeper than fear had me in its grip, something ancient, primal, and all-consuming. Karen, however, was unshaken. She turned to me with an eerie calm, closing the cabinet door with a soft, deliberate click. The sound reverberated in the silent room, sharp and final, like the snap of a trap. "You see now," she said, her voice low but unnervingly steady. "The truth about HR. It's not just policies or interviews. It's not even about the employees. It's about control, power, survival." Her words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. My throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper. What is this?" I croaked, my mind scrambling to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around me. "What's going on here?" Karen tilted her head, studying me like a scientist might study an insect pinned to a board. There was no malice in her gaze, just cold, clinical curiosity. "This isn't a company," she said, stepping closer. Her shadow stretched unnaturally across the floor, pooling at my feet like liquid night. "It's a mechanism, a balance, and everyone here plays their part, willingly or otherwise." Her words didn't answer my question. They only deepened the chasm of dread in my chest. I took another step back, but the darkness seemed to follow me, creeping along the edges of the room. "You've seen too much," Karen continued, her voice softening, almost tender. "And now you have a choice. You can become part of the system, or you can become fuel for it." My stomach twisted. "Fuel?" I whispered, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. Karen's smile widened, her teeth unnaturally white in the dim light. "Everything runs on something, even HR." Karen smiled, but it wasn't a smile meant for comfort. It was too wide, her teeth too perfect, her eyes too bright. It was a smile that said she was in control, that she knew more about me than I did. "What you're seeing, what you will see," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the price of becoming part of this company. You think you came here for a job? No, you came here to be chosen. Not by the company, not by HR, but by something else, something far older than any of us." The air in the room thickened, pressing down on my chest like an invisible hand. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing, closing in with every word she spoke. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the rational part of my brain that screamed for an explanation. Karen stepped closer, her movements fluid, almost unnatural. "You're not the first to discover the truth," she continued, her eyes gleaming with something feral, something hungry. "But you might be the last if you don't understand where you really are. This company, it doesn't just offer jobs. It offers survival, power, Immortality. I shook my head, retreating a step. The words made no sense. Their weight, too enormous to grasp. No, no, this isn't real. You're insane. This isn't how anything works. It's just a company. She laughed then, a sharp, jagged sound that didn't match the human mask she wore. You think this is just a company? She echoed, mockingly. You think you're just another employee? No, you're cattle, like the ones who came before you, grazing blindly in their little pens. And now? Now you're being led to the slaughter, or the altar, if you're lucky. My knees buckled slightly, but I steadied myself. I don't believe you, I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Karen leaned in closer, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the room, consuming the space between us. Oh, you will believe, she said softly, almost sweetly. They always do. The question is, what are you willing to give to stay alive? And then, as if on cue, something began to move behind her. The shadows behind Karen thickened, swirling like black smoke, until they shifted into a shape, unmistakable and wrong. A figure that was not human. It towered over Karen, its slick, stretched skin gleaming like oil under a dim light. The surface didn't ripple or crease, even as it moved, as though it existed outside the rules of anatomy. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red heat, burning through the air, fixing on me with a hunger that was both alien and terrifyingly familiar. The arms were long, spindly, and ended in clawed fingers that dragged against the floor with a wet, crunching scrape that made my stomach churn. You see him now, Karen said, her voice low and reverent, her eyes gleaming as if she'd been waiting for this moment. He's been watching you all along, and now you're exactly where he wants you to be. I tried to scream, but my throat closed, the cold air slicing into my lungs. My legs felt like lead as the creature tilted its head toward me. For a moment, its glowing eyes flickered, and I felt something sharp and invisible clawing at my chest, like it was pulling at something I couldn't name. What is this thing? I croaked, stumbling backward. What do you want from me? Karen's smile twisted into something wicked, a grotesque parody of corporate reassurance. He wants you, just like he wanted every other soul before you. It's why you're here. It's why we choose certain employees. We bring them into HR. We test them. And when they're ready, her voice dropped, cold and reverent. We let them become. The word hit me like a freight train. Become. The sound of it crawled under my skin, nesting in places it didn't belong. My mind scrambled to process, but there wasn't time. The creature moved. It didn't lunge. It unfolded, its elongated limbs snapping toward me like a spider pouncing on prey. Panic ignited my body. I turned and ran, my breath tearing through my chest. Behind me, I heard it. No, felt it. Pursuing. Its strides impossibly long, the wet scrape of its claws on the floor echoing in my ears. The hallway stretched ahead, but it was no longer familiar. The walls warped and shimmered, tilting inward, as if they were collapsing in slow motion. The lights flickered and dimmed, casting uneven shadows that danced like they were alive. I didn't dare look back. Looking back meant death or worse. I could feel its presence behind me, close enough that the cold radiating from its form bit into my skin. Karen's voice followed, distorted and guttural, each syllable a command. "Come back," she snarled, her tone a blend of mockery and authority. But it wasn't just her. Other voices joined in, a symphony of whispers that crawled from the walls, seeping into my ears like poison. They weren't just noise. They were people. Fragments of lives lost to this place, their warnings clawing at my sanity. "Run!" One hissed, urgent and broken. "It's too late." Another sobbed. The elevator doors slid open, and I rushed forward, only to stop cold in my tracks. Inside stood someone I recognized immediately, but it wasn't just a reflection. The figure in the elevator was unmistakably me, yet wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. His eyes were dark pits, deep and hollow, like they had never known light. His skin was ashen, stretched taut over his cheekbones, and his lips were pulled into an unsettlingly neutral line. His hands rested calmly at his sides, too still, like they had never moved before. For a moment, neither of us moved. The version of me tilted his head ever so slightly, as though studying me, not mimicking, assessing. The air felt thick, buzzing with static. My heart thundered in my chest, but my feet stayed rooted to the ground. Then the figure raised a single hand, palm open, in what should have been a gesture of greeting. Instead, it felt like a summons. I staggered back, the elevator doors sliding shut with an eerie finality. The lights in the hallway flickered twice, then died, plunging me into suffocating darkness. And in that void, Karen's voice rose, calm and dripping with inevitability, interwoven with the whispers of countless others. "Welcome to your new role." I woke up gasping, my lungs desperate for air, as though I had been drowning in the darkness of that place. My body trembled, drenched in cold sweat, the fabric of my clothes clinging to me like a second, suffocating skin. For one terrifying moment, I thought I was still there, still in that cursed office. But then, the hum of distant traffic and the faint scent of stale coffee anchored me. I was back in my apartment. I was safe, or so I wanted to believe. My legs wobbled as I staggered upright, every nerve in my body still electrified with the terror of what I'd seen. My mind clung to fragments, the glowing red eyes, Karen's twisted smile, the thing in the shadows. It was too real to be a dream, but too impossible to be reality. Wasn't it? I stumbled toward the window, craving light, clarity, something to sever the nightmare from the present. The city sprawled out before me, indifferent and alive. Cars honked. People moved in shadowed streets, bathed in the glow of flickering neon signs. It was a comfort and a cruelty, a reminder that the world went on, unshaken by horrors it didn't understand. But then, as I stared at the window, willing my heart to slow, something moved, not in the street below or in the room around me, but in the glass itself, a shadow. It wasn't mine. The figure lingered just long enough for recognition to strike, too long to be a trick of the light. My breath hitched, and I turned sharply, scanning the room, empty, yet in the silence, I felt it, a presence, watching, waiting. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. Standing in the doorway was a man, or something wearing the shape of one. He was tall, his silhouette unnervingly sharp against the dim light of my apartment. He wore a sleek black suit, immaculate, yet somehow wrong, like it had been tailored for someone or something not quite human. And then I saw his eyes, those molten red embers, the same eyes. The memories came crashing back, the elevator, Karen's voice wrapping around me like chains, and her final damning words. "Welcome to your new role." No, this wasn't real. I had escaped. I had to have escaped. But my legs betrayed me. They felt like lead, rooted to the floor, my body bound by an invisible force, as though the air itself had conspired to hold me in place. The figure stepped forward, with agonizing slowness, his movements impossibly smooth, the cold weight of his presence pressing down on me with every step. And then, without a word, he reached into his jacket. My heart pounded as his hand emerged, holding a business card. At first glance, it was ordinary, stark white with the company's familiar logo, but then The edges of the card began to blacken, curling as though it were burning without flame. The logo twisted before my eyes, dark tendrils spilling from its edges like ink spreading in water. He extended it toward me, his movements deliberate, his hand trembling slightly, as if savoring my reaction. "You're one of them now," he rasped. His voice like dry leaves dragged across pavement. He leaned in, the heat of his molten eyes scorching the space between us. "Welcome to the team." Before I could react, he vanished. His figure dissolved into the shadows, consumed by the darkness, as if he had never been there. But the air told a different story. My apartment was colder now, the kind of cold that burrows into your bones and lingers, unshakable. The familiar hum of the city outside had dimmed, replaced by an oppressive silence. Everything felt wrong. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was all a hallucination born from stress or fear. But the burning business card in my hand told the truth. Its edges still smoldered, curling inward, ash falling in slow, deliberate spirals onto the floor. I couldn't drop it, no matter how badly I wanted to. My fingers wouldn't release it, as if the card itself had fused with my skin. Deep down, I knew I was one of them now. Not an employee, not a cog in the machine. Something worse, something chosen, something that could never leave. The HR department wasn't just a function of the company. It was the company. It was alive, and it had claimed me. I wasn't just another recruit. I was a piece of its legacy now, bound to it in ways I couldn't yet understand. And then I felt it, a shift deep within me, a crawling sensation, ancient and relentless, unfurling in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't new. It had been there all along, waiting in the dark recesses of my soul. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This was why they had chosen me, why they had lured me here. It wasn't a promotion. It was a transformation. I stared at the card in my hand as it dissolved completely into ash, leaving a faint, blackened mark on my palm. The mark pulsed, glowing faintly, as though it had become part of me. There was no escape. I wasn't free. I never had been.
Well, wasn't that a productive little performance review? Our protagonist really climbed the corporate ladder, right into the jaws of an eldritch horror. Turns out, they were the perfect hire after all, because once you join this company, you never clock out. Talk about a dead-end job. So, my frightful friends, the moral of tonight's tale is clear. Always read the fine print. And remember, when HR says they're here to help, they may just mean themselves, to a serving of you. And speaking of help, why not help me by clicking that like button, subscribing to my tales of terror, and leaving a scream-worthy comment below. After all, I'd hate for you to miss your next performance evaluation. Until next time, boils and ghouls, stay employed.